The question is, will 3 come out of New Hampshire? What do you think?
Well, we seem to be in this ever-decreasing Republican field, which we see every 4 years, with Iowa and New Hampshire being the linchpin states here.
Yeah.
I think it really depends on how Nikki Haley does in New Hampshire. If she manages to have an upset there, I think it would be hard for Ron DeSantis to continue. And that puts her clearly in a strong position going into South Carolina and then on into Super Tuesday.
Dan, I know that you've been reporting on this all day. There have been some concerns about a very early call from the Associated Press and some of the news networks last evening, calling the race just a half hour into the actual caucus process. The DeSantis campaign calling this now election interference. Are we going to hear more about this, or are we moving on to New Hampshire?
Well, at this point, I think we may hear a little bit more about it, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And I think that what we'll see moving forward is sort of an attempt to kind of put some of that behind you. You get a bad call in a football game, you sort of try to move past it and do better in the next play. And certainly as we head into New Hampshire, there's not a lot of time between now and then. I think the candidates will really be focused on trying to turn out voters in that state and beyond. So there's really not a lot of time for looking backward in today's politics. So I don't imagine that we'll hear too much more about that, although you never know.
Well, sure thing. Election interference has been a bit of a theme for Republicans over the last couple of years. Megan, government shutdowns have been quite a theme in Washington as well. And to see these unfold at the same time is really something. Here we are now in the middle of the first 2 nominating contests with a potential government shutdown. It does appear that the leadership, though, has a plan to avert one. What are you hearing as the Senate tries to jam the House?
Sure. So in about the next hour or so, the Senate's going to be taking a vote to essentially jumpstart the process this week in the hopes of passing yet another short-term spending bill by Thursday and then kicking it over to the House to pass before the midnight deadline. There would be a partial government shutdown starting on Saturday in the absence of any funding. This bill would essentially keep the government open for a few more weeks, sets up 2 new deadlines, March 1st and March 8th, to allow congressional negotiators some additional time to hash out funding differences. But the differences are pretty broad, and it's as you mentioned, this is playing out in the context of the presidential primary season, and hardliners are upset with Speaker Johnson. So there's a lot of give and take here, and it's going to continue to be quite an effort to get these bills done before even the new deadlines.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you see this actually working. Megan, you can weigh in on that if you want, but we've got a headline that Mike Johnson is going to be meeting with President Biden tomorrow. What's on the agenda? Is it the potential shutdown? There are going to be more involved in this supplemental request for funding for Ukraine, for Israel, that, of course, rides on a border deal.
So topic A, according to the White House and other sources, is Ukraine and the broader national security supplemental, which also includes money for Israel and money for Taiwan. But it's really that $61 billion for Ukraine that has been tied up now for weeks amid pushback from hardliners, particularly folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has gone as far as to say that she would seek to oust Speaker Mike Johnson should he proceed with that funding. So this is going to be quite a meeting, the first between the Speaker and the President since the fall. And whether we come out of that with some sort of agreement for Ukraine remains to be seen. But I'm certain that other topics such as the government shutdown and spending levels writ large, as well as this emerging tax deal, will probably be discussed at this meeting.
Well, as the meeting of the minds happens in Washington tomorrow, Dan, you've got Mike Johnson and Joe Biden with potentially the future of Ukraine in their hands here as they talk about this. President Zelenskyy from Ukraine today went to Davos, and he spoke to the World Economic Forum about his cause. Here's what he said.
Every reduction in pressure on the aggressor adds years to the war, but every investment in the confidence of the defender shortens the war.
Who was the audience for this speech, Dan?
Well, you saw the president of the CEO of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, meeting Volodymyr Zelenskiy this morning and telling him, God bless you, basically. And so you have the masters of the universe, to a certain extent, gathered at Davos, the financiers, the folks who really have an influence on policy and on thinking in world capitals. So they're the audience. And I think that Zelensky is sort of trying to address not only them, but certainly the governments worldwide, to tell them that, look, we need pressure on Russia, we need financial backing for Ukraine in order to get this conflict to a place where there can be some sort of peace agreement, where there can be some sort of settlement on favorable terms for Ukraine and not on terms that are more favorable to Russia. So he's really trying to work his rhetorical magic on that audience, but also beyond that to the White House and to Congress, particularly here in the U.S., because Ukraine cannot do any of this without financial and military backing from the U.S. at this point.
Well, geopolitics has become quite a juggling act for this administration. While we talk about Ukraine, of course, a hot war that's happening between Israel and Hamas, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is taking a look at what's happening in the Red Sea. He was also at the World Economic Forum in Davos, knowing that we struck back once again at Houthi rebels in Yemen for their attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. Here he is.
We mobilized a coalition of countries to take strikes to degrade the Houthis' capabilities so their ability to mount sustained and complex attacks becomes more difficult over time. But we did not say when we launched our attacks, they're going to end once and for all. The Houthis will be fully deterred. We anticipated the Houthis would continue to try to hold this critical artery at risk, and we continue to reserve the right to take further action, but this needs to be an all-hands-on-deck effort.
Dan, we continue to go back around to hit Houthi rebels in Yemen following that initial attack that involved the U.S. and the U.K. Should we get used to this, or more where this came from?
Well, I think, unfortunately, there is going to be more attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, and I think that there will be responses from the U.S. and its allies on those attacks, or to those attacks. It's notable to me that when Jake Sullivan was talking there, he was really emphasizing the fact that this is a, quote, global, unquote, issue. So he's really trying to put the onus not just on the U.S. and its allies, but really on anyone who is reliant on goods that make their way through that Red Sea corridor, to say that this kind of aggression needs to stop. So he's trying to take it outside of sort of the Israel-Gaza issue and move it into something that is more about global commerce and something that is going to affect really world trade, rather than something that is tied to a certain political issue or conflict, a specific conflict in the region.